Her name was Teresa Morgan. She was 34 years old when a quiet morning on her parents' farm in Texas turned into something no one in that house would ever recover from. She noticed it, the exact moment her younger brother thought no one was watching. He leaned slightly over the breakfast table, moving just enough to block the view from anyone sitting across from him, his expression calm, almost careful. His hand slipped from his pocket, holding a small folded packet. He didn't rush, he didn't hesitate, he simply opened it and let something fall into the food placed in front of their parents. Teresa didn't breathe. She didn't react, not out loud, not even a flinch, because in that same second she saw something else. He glanced up, not surprised, not afraid, but aware, as if he had already considered the possibility that someone might see. As if it didn't matter, her heart started pounding, not from fear alone, but from a realization forming too quickly to ignore. This wasn't a mistake, this wasn't sudden. This was planned, and somehow she was already part of it. She didn't shout. She didn't warn anyone. Instead, she stood up, walked toward the kitchen like nothing had happened, and came back with a steady hand. Plates shifted slightly under her fingers. Small movements no one questioned, and just like that, everything changed places. Seconds later, his wife came down the stairs. She smiled, took a seat, and picked up the plate that was never meant for her. Teresa sat back down slowly, her pulse loud in her ears as the room carried on, like nothing had changed. Her brother watched their parents, waiting for something to happen. But it didn't, because the wrong person had taken the first bite. And the moment her expression changed, Teresa understood exactly how far this plan was meant to go, and how close she had come to losing everything without even knowing it. Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I always wonder how far these stories travel and who they reach. And if you enjoy real, intense family stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's begin. Just hours earlier, nothing about that morning felt unusual on the Morgan family farm. Teresa Morgan had arrived before sunrise, driving past long stretches of dry land and fencing that hadn't been repaired in years. The kind of place that held on to silence longer than comfort. She hadn't been back in 5 years, not since the day she walked out with a single suitcase, and no one tried to stop her. Coming back hadn't been a choice made lightly, but her mother's declining health had forced a decision she had avoided for too long. When she stepped inside the house, the air felt the same, heavy, in a way that didn't come from heat, but from history that had never been resolved. Her father sat at the table already dressed for the day, pretending his hands didn't shake when he reached for his coffee, while her mother moved slowly between the counter and the stove, refusing help, even when it was obvious she needed it. Neither of them asked Teresa how she had been, and she didn't offer. Across the room, her younger brother, Scott Morgan, leaned against the doorway with an ease that didn't match the tension she felt, watching everything with quiet attention. He had been living there for months, taking over the responsibilities Teresa's had once been told she wasn't capable of handling, and somehow he fit into the space as if he had never left. His wife, Paula Morgan, was already awake too, moving through the kitchen with controlled precision, opening cabinets before anyone asked and closing them before anyone noticed. She greeted Teresa with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of expression that looked practiced rather than genuine. Teresa noticed the way Paula answered questions before Scott could speak, the way decisions were made without discussion, and how quickly her parents accepted it without resistance. It didn't feel like a family adjusting to change. It felt like something had already been decided long before Teresa stepped back into the house. When breakfast was mentioned, Paula suggested Teresa should cook, saying it casually, as if it were a thoughtful gesture. But the timing felt too perfect to ignore. Teresa agreed without argument, even though something about it didn't sit right, and as she moved around the kitchen preparing a simple meal, she became aware of how quiet the others had become. Conversation stayed short, glances were exchanged without explanation, and every small detail seemed slightly out of place. Not enough to confront, but enough to stay with her. She didn't know what was wrong yet, only that something was, and that whatever it was had nothing to do with her. Coming back after 5 years, it had already been there, waiting. The tension didn't appear all at once. It had been building long before Teresa Morgan stepped back onto that land. Growing up in that house had never felt like belonging, more like surviving a place where every mistake stayed longer than any achievement. Her older sister had always been the one her parents spoke about with pride, the one who did things right, while Teresa learned early that anything she did would be measured against someone else and come up short. When arguments happened, they weren't loud. They were quiet and cutting, delivered in ways that didn't leave marks, but stayed with her anyway. Over time, it became easier for her family to treat her absence as normal than to acknowledge how she had been pushed out. 5 years without contact had turned into an unspoken agreement, and returning now didn't erase that distance. It only made it more visible. Later that morning, Teresa stepped outside for air, walking past the edge of the field where the fences leaned slightly, and the ground showed signs of neglect, and that was where she saw Victor Hale for the first time in years. He wasn't part of the family, never had been, but he knew enough about them to understand what most people ignored. He greeted her with a brief nod instead of surprise, as if her return had been expected, and when they spoke, his tone stayed low, careful not to carry back toward the house. He asked how long she planned to stay, and when she didn't answer directly, he didn't press. But his next words came slower, more deliberate. He mentioned that things around the farm had changed in ways that didn't make sense, small decisions being made too quickly, paperwork handled without discussion, and money moving in ways that didn't match the situation her parents were in. Teresa listened without interrupting, not because she trusted everything he said, but because it matched the feeling she couldn't explain since arriving. Before leaving, Victor paused just long enough to add that if something felt off, it usually was, and that ignoring it rarely made it go away. When Teresa returned inside, the atmosphere hadn't improved. It had settled into something quieter, more controlled, as if everyone had already adjusted to a version of reality she wasn't fully part of. Scott moved through the room with confidence that didn't come from experience but from certainty. While Paula stayed close enough to guide conversations without appearing to lead them, Teresa noticed how often decisions were made without being spoken aloud, how her parents agreed without hesitation, and how easily her presence was overlooked, unless it served a purpose. Nothing openly wrong had happened, yet every detail pointed in the same direction. Something had shifted in that house, and whatever it was had been set in motion long before she came back. back at the table, every movement carried a weight Teresa Morgan could not ignore. The chairs scraped lightly against the floors as everyone settled into place, the sound sharper than it should have been. And for a brief moment, nothing felt out of line, except the silence that followed. Her father spoke about the fence, needing repairs. Her mother nodded without really listening. And Scott Morgan leaned back in his chair, with a calm that didn't match the tension building beneath the surface. Paula Morgan remained quiet, her attention shifting between the table and Scott, in a way that didn't look accidental. Teresa sat across from them, watching without appearing to, her hands steady, even as something inside her refused to settle. When Scott suddenly stood up, the movement seemed casual enough. A small interruption that didn't draw attention from anyone else. He muttered something about forgetting an item and stepped toward the counters behind them, his pace controlled, unhurried. Teresa didn't turn her head, but her eyes followed him from the edge of her vision, catching every detail without making it obvious. He paused for a fraction of a second, then glanced over his shoulder, once, then again, not quickly, not nervously, but carefully, as if confirming something rather than checking for danger. That was the moment everything shifted. His hand moved toward his pocket and came back, holding something small, folded tightly, almost invisible, unless someone was already looking for it. He opened it with precision, letting a fine substance fall into one of the dishes placed in front of their parents, then used the spoon to stir it, just enough to disappear completely. The action lasted only seconds, but Teresa felt it stretch longer, each movement locking into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt. When Scott turned back, his expression hadn't changed. The same calm face, the same controlled posture, as if nothing had happened at all. But his eyes met hers for the briefest instant, and in that look, there was no confusion, no surprise, only awareness. Teresa understood immediately that this wasn't something she had stumbled upon by accident, and that whatever was about to happen had already accounted for her being there. Her first instinct was to react, to interrupt, to stop everything before it reached the table. But the thought disappeared almost as quickly as it formed, without proof, without time, without any way to explain what she had just seen. She knew exactly how it would be turned against her. Instead, she pushed her chair back slowly, her voice steady when she spoke about forgetting something in the kitchen, giving no one a reason to question her movement. She walked away without rushing, each step measured, her breathing controlled, as she forced herself to think clearly. When she returned, the table looked exactly the same. Nothing visibly different, nothing that would warn anyone else. Teresa reached forward under the simplest excuse, adjusting the placement of the dishes as if making space, her hands moving naturally, almost casually, shifting one plate, then another, until the arrangement no longer matched what had been there before. Scott didn't notice, his attention briefly elsewhere, and no one else was watching closely enough to question it. Teresa sat back down, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral, but inside, every second sharpened into focus. She didn't know exactly how it would unfold, only that it would. And that the outcome no longer belonged to the plan that had been set in motion before she walked into that room. Then everything changed in a matter of seconds. Paula Morgan stepped into the room, with a soft comment about feeling better. Her tone light enough to pass without attention, and she took her seat beside Scott, without hesitation, reaching for the plate in front of her, as if it had always been meant for her. Teresa Morgan didn't move, didn't speak. Her focus fixed on the smallest details. The way Paula adjusted her posture, the way Scott's attention shifted toward their parents instead of his wife, and how no one else noticed the quiet imbalance forming at the table. The first bite came without pause, a simple motion that carried no weight to anyone except Teresa, who felt every second stretch longer than it should have. Paula chewed slowly, swallowed, then reached for her glass. But something in her expression changed before she could take another bite. It wasn't immediate panic, not dramatic enough to draw instant alarm, just a subtle hesitation, a delay in movement that didn't belong. There. Her hand stopped midway, fingers tightening slightly around the fork, and the color in her face began to fade in a way that was impossible to miss once it started. Scott's reaction came a fraction too late, his posture shifting forward as if he was only just realizing something had gone wrong. His eyes locking onto Paula with a sharp intensity that broke the calm he had maintained all morning. Teresa remained still, her breathing even. Her expression controlled, while inside her thoughts moved faster than anything happening at the table. Paula tried to speak, but the words didn't come out clearly. Her voice catching in her throat as she pushed her chair back, the sound louder than expected in the tight space. Teresa's mother stood up abruptly, confusion replacing the quiet routine that had filled the room moments earlier. While her father looked between them, unable to understand what had changed so quickly. Scott reached for Paula, calling her name in a voice that carried real fear now, not the controlled tone he had used before, and when she tried to stand, her balance gave out, forcing him to catch her before she hit the floor. Seeped, the room shifted from silence to noise, without warning, questions overlapping, movement becoming uncoordinated, and still, Teresa did not step forward immediately. She allowed a brief second to pass, just enough to make her reaction match everyone else's, before pulling out her phone and stating clearly that she was calling for help. Scott looked at her then, not long, not openly, but enough for her to see the change in his expression. The realization settling, in that whatever had been planned was no longer under his control. Teresa held his gaze for that brief moment without reacting, without giving him anything he could use, then turned her attention back to Paula as if nothing else mattered. Her mother hovered nearby, asking what had happened, her voice unsteady, while her father stepped back, overwhelmed by the sudden shift he couldn't explain. Teresa spoke only when necessary, keeping her tone level, answering simple questions, giving nothing away, even as she watched the situation unfold with a clarity no one else in that room had. When the sound of approaching sirens finally reached the house, it didn't bring relief. It only marked the point where whatever had been hidden could no longer stay that way, and Teresa remained exactly where she was, composed, silent, and fully aware that the outcome had already begun to move in a direction no one at that table had expected. By the time the ambulance disappeared far down the dirt road, the situation had already begun to shift in ways no one inside the house could fully control. Teresa Morgan remained near the entrance as uniformed officers arrived not long after, their presence changing the atmosphere from confusion to something more structured, more precise. Questions came quickly, direct, and methodical. And, for the first time that morning, attention settled on details instead of emotion. Teresa answered calmly when asked, keeping her tone consistent, describing only what she had done without adding anything unnecessary, while Scott Morgan stood nearby, speaking more than required, filling gaps that had not been questioned. his words coming slightly too fast to sound natural. Paula Morgan had already been taken away for treatment, leaving behind a space that felt heavier than her presence had, and in that absence, small inconsistencies began to stand out. One of the officers examined the table carefully, noting the positions of the dishes, the remnants left behind, and the differences that didn't align with a simple explanation. Another collected what remained of the food, sealing it without comment, while asking who had prepared the meal and who had handled each part of it. Teresa stated clearly that she had cooked, exactly as expected, and for a brief moment the direction of suspicion leaned toward her, matching the structure of a story that had been carefully arranged before that morning began. Scott did not correct it, instead reinforcing it with subtle agreement. His voice controlled but edged with something that suggested urgency rather than concern. Teresa did not respond to that shift, allowing the process to continue without interruption, knowing that anything she added too early would only complicate what needed to unfold on its own. As the officers continued their work, one of them asked about recent changes around the property, financial decisions, ownership documents, and access to accounts that had previously been managed differently. Scott hesitated at that point, just briefly, but enough for it to be noticed, and when he answered, the explanation lacked the certainty he had shown earlier. That hesitation redirected the conversation, drawing attention toward areas that had not been part of the initial focus. And within that shift, the structure holding his version of events began to weaken. Later, when the officers stepped outside to review collected information, Teresa observed the change in their posture, the quiet exchange between them indicating that what they had found did not match the surface narrative. Naspers. When they returned, the questions were no longer general, they were specific, directed toward actions taken before the morning began rather than during it. Scott's responses became shorter, less controlled, and for the first time, he avoided direct eye contact, something he had maintained carefully until that point. Teresa remained composed, answering only when addressed. Her role in the situation now clearly defined by consistency rather than assumption. It was not a sudden revelation that shifted the direction entirely, but a gradual alignment of details that could no longer be ignored, the kind that builds quietly until it becomes undeniable. By the time additional evidence was referenced, including communications and records that connected decisions made over time, the focus had moved away from Teresa completely, settling instead on a pattern that pointed elsewhere, toward planning that extended beyond a single moment and intention that had been in place long before that morning began. Months later, the outcome no one in that family could have imagined became impossible to deny. The legal process moved forward with a clarity that stripped away any version of events that had once been controlled, and what remained was a sequence of decisions that could be traced, examined, and proven without relying on assumption. Teresa Morgan sat quietly through each stage, present but distant, as records were presented. Conversations were reviewed, and patterns that had once been hidden were laid out in a way that left no room for reinterpretation. Scott Morgan no longer carried the same composure he had shown before, his confidence replaced by a silence that spoke more clearly than any explanation he could have offered. While Paula Morgan faced a separate set of consequences tied directly to the role she had played in shaping the plan that had unfolded. The court did not move quickly, but it moved with certainty. And by the time decisions were finalized, the outcome reflected not just a single moment, but an extended chain of intent that had been building over time. Scott was given a sentence that ensured he would not return to that house for many years. His actions defined in a way that could not be softened or explained away, while Paula was held accountable through charges that addressed her involvement with equal weight, leaving neither of them with the ability to shift responsibility elsewhere. Teresa's parents attended every hearing, their presence marked by a quiet disbelief that never fully turned into acceptance, as if understanding the truth did not make it any easier to live with. They tried at different moments to reach toward Teresa in ways they had not before, speaking with a softness that had been absent throughout her life, but those attempts arrived too late to change anything that had already taken shape. Teresa did not respond with anger, nor did she offer comfort. She simply maintained a distance that reflected the reality of what their family had become. When the legal process ended, she returned to the farm one final time, not to rebuild anything, but to close a chapter that had never truly been repaired. The house looked the same from the outside, but nothing inside it held the meaning it once claimed to have, and whatever connection had tied her to that place no longer existed in a way that required her to stay. She gathered what belonged to her, spoke only when necessary, and left without hesitation, not looking back, because there was nothing left that needed to be seen again. For Teresa, the lesson did not come from what had happened at the table, or from the outcome in court. It came from recognizing how easily silence can allow things to grow unchecked, and how often people ignore what they sense, simply because it is uncomfortable to confront. She understood that loyalty without awareness can become a weakness, and that trust, given without question, can be used in ways that cannot be undone. Walking away was not an act of anger. It was a decision built on clarity, the kind that comes when everything has already been revealed, and nothing remains uncertain. She did not lose her family in a single moment. She had lost them gradually over years of imbalance, and what happened that morning only made it visible in a way that could no longer be denied. In the end, she'd not see herself as someone who had taken anything away from them, only as someone who chose not to be part of something that had already broken long before she returned.